Early access has been out for almost 2 years by now, and the vast majority of people who are watching this video will also be people who evidently are playing early access as well. So in some sense, I'm obviously preaching to the choir. But nonetheless, occasionally I'll get comments, and I see comments elsewhere, about the nature of early access and how it's just a bad thing in general, as well as the fact that Larian is taking a rather long time, nearly 2 years, and by the time the full game is released, possibly 2.5 or 3 years after it began, depending on what the gods ordain. And so first I want to talk about why early access is simply more common these days than it used to be, in my humble opinion, as well as why it's probably not necessarily a bad thing. Early access is a relatively new phenomenon as far as gaming is concerned. The first instance of it was in fact Minecraft in 2009. But since then there have been many instances of early access. And yes, some developers do in fact engage in early access for easy cash grabs. And of course that's the first accusation you will hear from people, that the reason why a particular game is in early access is to ensure that the money is there. And for many developers indeed that might be the case, but I don't think that's universal. The following of what I'm about to say is not applicable to all games, but I do think it applies to complex RPGs, and BG3 is a fairly complex RPG. In particular, because getting the mechanics right early on is a very important task indeed, because the mechanics of the game, as we see them now, are going to be much less susceptible to a rework upon full release, whereas in early access, you have a fair bit of flexibility, maybe even a great deal of flexibility, to play around with it, to see what works, etc., etc. And as these mechanics are going to define the entire game, not just the early access part or Act 1, it's very important to get them right. When you have a game as massive as Baldur's Gate 3, it won't hurt and probably will only help to have a phase, even if the phase is very long and protracted, of early access, because that allows the developers to see what the players like, what they don't like, and allows them to tweak different things. Sure, in an ideal world, we would all want a game that's complete, with no problems with it. And on top of that, a game that appeals to everybody. But that's just not the reality. And I think part of the justification for an early access phase, like we have with Baldur's Gate 3, is the relative complexity and massive size of the game. I think it is not a bad justification at all. Another point I want to make, and I think this is probably a more relevant point, is very few people who buy early access, and thus ensuring the full purchase of the game later upon full release, are people that were not going to play the game. Which is to say, barring some catastrophe or some unforeseen disaster, each and every one of us who is engaging in early access and critiquing it and offering our opinions and feedback, we are all people, probably to a man I might assume, that will play the full release of the game, even if that full release isn't amazing. And that's not what I'm saying. I think the full release will probably be quite amazing. But nonetheless, we all had that original intention of playing the full game upon release, and early access is a means to that. Even though it is at times tedious, it is limited, of course buggy, it is early access after all, but I think that's just par for the course. And on this point, what I'm essentially saying is that the people who are playing early access are the people who have always been most interested in this game. And so early access isn't hurting the people who potentially down the line, after the full game has been released, hear about this game and hear good things, presumably. Because ultimately, these so-called latecomers who get the game after full release are benefiting from the feedback and the work that has been put into early access and think, I guess I'll play this, I guess I'll get this game. Because the other people were going to play and get the game regardless of the circumstances, whether there had been an early access or not. And this, of course, has the added benefit that, as a player in early access, you get to give feedback, and that will help shape and sculpt the game. And then hopefully, the final product, the full release, then comports with your wishes and your desires. And at the end of the day, no one is harmed by this. The people who get the game later will enjoy the game for what it is, and we have all participated in this process. A final point. Yes, it is taking a rather long time. And I've seen a number of people, both in my videos and elsewhere, complain about that, but it doesn't really bother me, in the sense that hopefully they're implementing important changes, and every iteration of every patch shows that they are indeed doing this. Whether it means introducing a new race like the gnomes, or a new class like the bard, or something such as swarm AI, there are significant changes that are introduced with each patch, and overall they do improve the game, which means that if Larian does in fact take say, 3 years to fully release the game. And this game is then released in Q3 or Q4 of 2023, i.e. sometime in autumn or winter, then it's not going to be the end of the world, because everything that's happening now is leading to ever greater refinement of the game. And for that reason, I'm not particularly worried, to be perfectly honest. Now, regarding this, there's a famous saying in the development world, a catchphrase, if you will, coined allegedly by none other than the Japanese developer Geru Miyamoto. And the saying is quite simple: a delayed game is eventually good, but a rush game is forever bad. Now, that's not necessarily technically true, because a rush game can be worked on after release, but that's always a lot worse. I'm talking to you, Cyberpunk 2077. However, after having said all of that, there are certain risks, I think, associated with working on a game, developing a game for too long. In general, it's also something you can observe in the world of art, for example. Constantly want to redo things, add things to a painting or a picture. And there's no better example of this than the rather tragic case of Star Citizen, a game that has been in development for well over a decade, with something to show for it, but no finished product. When will it ever be done? Maybe never. And so you can end up in that situation, in a trap where you're just working on things, and it is never finished. But I don't think Larian is heading in that direction, as they have already announced, at the very least, an approximate date, and in all likelihood they're going to stick to that, and even if they don't, it probably will only be a small delay. I don't expect Baldur's Gate 3 to take 10 years to be brought out to market. My only real concern is the very distinct possibility that most of the work will be done on Act 1, and Act 2 and 3 will suffer as a consequence, simply because we don't have direct access to it, and that tends to be a general trend. So you'll notice and observe in a game like Wrath of the Righteous that most of the chapters of the acts are pretty replete with content, but when you get to the final chapter, Chapter 5, it's very sparse, it's lacking in certain things, and it just feels empty. It feels incomplete. Whereas if you look at Chapter 3 and 4 and 2 and 1, it has everything that it needs. And so I'm a little concerned that Larian might skimp a little bit on the final chapter, but who knows, we'll have to wait and see. And so I'm not too concerned. I'm not a fanboy. I have my criticisms. Like I said, the character creator is, for me, the biggest issue. It doesn't have to be for everybody else, but for me, that's probably the biggest issue so far. Other than that, I am reasonably content. But more importantly, I would love to hear what you have to say about the rather long road of early access that we have trodden upon, and whether or not you are content with it or not content, and whether or not you think it's taking too long or not. Do let me know what you think, and in any event, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, subscribe. Really appreciate it. Helps out the channel, and I'll check you out later. Take care.